Have you ever walked into a room where everyone expected you to fail, and smiled anyway? That was me, standing alone at a courtroom defense table. No attorney beside me, no family whispering encouragement in my ear, just a thick folder of documents and a lifetime of being underestimated. My brother leaned toward me just before the proceedings began, loud enough for half the room to hear, and said those exact words. "No lawyer, you're finished." A few people actually chuckled. My father smiled like a man who had already written the ending to this story. Their attorney, one of the most expensive probate lawyers in the state, leaned back in his chair with the relaxed confidence of someone who had already decided how the day would end. And I just stood there, calm, quiet, exactly the way they had always seen me. Exactly the way they had always been wrong about me. Hey, if you're new here and you love stories about resilience, family, justice, and people proving the world completely wrong, smash that subscribe button right now. Hit the like button because this story deserves it. And share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Now let's get into it. My name is Emily Carter. At the time these events unfolded, I was 32 years old and a commissioned officer in the United States Army. Most people who met me for the first time saw a calm woman with a controlled voice and careful posture, polite, disciplined, quiet. What they never saw were the years that created that silence. The years that built the woman who walked into that courtroom alone and walked out having dismantled everything. I grew up in a small town in Ohio with my father, my mother, and my older brother Jason. In our house, there was one simple unspoken rule. Jason mattered. I didn't. Nobody ever said those exact words out loud. They never had to. You learn things through repetition. Jason forgot to do his chores, he was tired. I forgot to do mine, I was irresponsible. Jason got a C on a test. School just wasn't for everyone. I got an A-, why wasn't it an A? The older I became, the clearer the pattern became. My father worshipped my brother. He called him his legacy, his future, the son who would carry the family name forward. I was simply the daughter, the backup child, the one expected to contribute without ever being noticed. My mother wasn't a cruel woman. She was simply exhausted. Years of trying to keep the peace in that house had worn her down in ways I didn't fully understand until I was much older. When my father criticized me, she would lower her eyes and say nothing. At 12 years old, I stopped expecting her to defend me. At 16, I stopped asking. The silence between us became its own kind of language. The only person in that family who ever truly saw me was my grandfather, Colonel William Carter. Retired Army officer, Vietnam veteran, a man who rarely raised his voice because he simply never needed to. He had a way of looking at people that made them tell the truth whether they wanted to or not. When I was 13, he found me sitting alone behind his garage after my father had spent 20 minutes explaining in great detail why Jason deserved a new truck and why I didn't deserve a dinner to celebrate my scholarship. Grandpa sat down beside me without saying a word. He handed me a bottle of root beer. We stayed quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "You know why they're wrong about you?" I shrugged. He smiled at me. "Because they're measuring you with the wrong ruler." I never forgot that sentence. Not once in the 20 years that followed. When I turned 18, I enlisted. My father hated it. "You're throwing your life away. You'll quit in 6 months. You don't belong in the military." I stood in the kitchen listening to every word he said. Then my grandfather quietly stood up from the table and said, "Funny, you said the same thing about me." The room went completely silent. That was the first and only time I ever watched my father lose an argument. The Army changed everything for me. Not because it was easy, because it absolutely was not. Basic training was brutal. The deployments were harder. The sacrifices never stopped. But for the first time in my entire life, effort actually mattered. Results mattered. Discipline mattered. Nobody cared whether I was someone's daughter. Nobody cared whether my father approved of me. The uniform didn't care. The mission didn't care, and I loved that more than I can possibly explain. Over the next decade, I built a real career. Promotions came. Commendations came. Responsibilities grew year after year. My father barely acknowledged any of it. When I became an officer, he changed the subject. When I received awards, he started talking about Jason. When I bought my first house, he asked why I wasn't married yet. Jason, meanwhile, bounced between one failed business and the next. Failed investments, failed relationships, failed everything. And each time he fell, my father rushed in to rescue him. Money, excuses, Second chances, third chances, 10th chances. The pattern never changed. Not once. Then my mother passed away after a sudden illness, and that loss fractured whatever remained of our family. My father became more bitter. Jason became more entitled. And my grandfather became my anchor. I called him every single Sunday. Sometimes we talked about military history, sometimes baseball, sometimes absolutely nothing important at all. Those conversations became precious to me, especially as I slowly began to understand they wouldn't last forever. 3 years after losing my mother, I got the call. Grandpa had suffered a stroke. By the time I arrived at the hospital, he was conscious, but weak. I sat beside his bed for hours without moving. At one point, he reached over and squeezed my hand. "Still carrying the family on your back." I laughed through tears. "Trying," I told him. He smiled at me. Good. That was the last real conversation we ever had. 2 weeks later, he was gone. The funeral brought everyone together, at least physically. Emotionally, we were miles apart. Jason spent most of the service looking at his phone. My father accepted condolences like a politician greeting voters at a campaign stop. I stood beside the casket and remembered the only man who had believed in me before I even believed in myself. A week later, we gathered for the reading of the will. The attorney began calmly. A few personal items, some charitable donations, some family keepsakes. Then everything changed. The largest asset in Grandpa's estate was a substantial investment portfolio, and several properties accumulated over decades, worth millions, far more than anyone in that room had expected. The attorney adjusted his glasses and read Grandpa's decision. The majority would go to me. Not Jason, not my father, me. The room completely froze. Jason actually laughed out loud. He genuinely thought it was some kind of mistake. Then he realized it wasn't. My father's face turned dark red. The attorney repeated himself. Jason stood up. My father pointed directly at me across the table and said, "You manipulated him." The accusation hit the room like a gunshot. I stared at him. "You don't actually believe that." "Oh, I do." 3 weeks later, they filed suit. Undue influence, manipulation, fraud. They wanted the will invalidated. They wanted everything. And they truly believed they would get it, because they had never bothered to learn who I had actually become. I informed the court I would represent myself. When my father heard that, he laughed. Jason laughed even harder, and as we entered the courthouse on the first morning of the trial, he leaned toward me and said it. "No, lawyer, you're finished." The morning of the trial felt strangely ordinary. Gray sky above the courthouse, a light wind pushing fallen leaves across the parking lot, people hurrying past with coffee cups and briefcases like it was just another workday. For them, it probably was. For me, it was the day my family intended to erase everything my grandfather had chosen to leave behind. I sat in my car for a moment and looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face looked calm. Years in uniform had taught me something valuable about that. Fear and confidence often look exactly the same from the outside. The difference only exists inside your head. Their attorney was Richard Lawson, one of the most successful probate attorneys in the entire state. The kind of man whose hourly rate alone was higher than most people earn in a week. When he looked me over in the hallway that morning, he was professional, polite, completely confident. He said, "I understand you've chosen to represent yourself." I told him I had. He nodded slowly. "That is certainly your right." The translation was obvious. "You are making a terrible mistake." I almost smiled. Lawson's strategy became clear almost immediately once the proceedings began. He wasn't trying to prove my grandfather had been mentally incompetent. That would have been nearly impossible given the man's history. Instead, he intended to convince the court that I had influenced an elderly man during a vulnerable period of his life. A much softer target, especially because I had spoken with Grandpa frequently during his final years. The witnesses he called were neighbors, family acquaintances, people who knew Grandpa socially. Each testimony was subtle, nothing explosive, just small pieces arranged into a larger picture. Emily visited often. Emily called constantly. Emily was unusually close to him. Emily was there when the will changed. Therefore, Emily must have been manipulating him. It was clever, careful, and completely wrong. By lunchtime on that first day, my father looked satisfied. Jason looked ecstatic. He was practically already spending the money. And I sat quietly on a bench near a window, reviewing my notes, waiting, because patience is one of the first things the Army teaches you, and I had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. During a recess, Judge Harold Bennett stopped near where I was sitting. I had researched him extensively beforehand. Former prosecutor, military family background, known for being extraordinarily fair, but nearly impossible to deceive. He asked me directly why I had chosen to represent myself. I could have given him the practical answers. Attorneys are expensive. The estate shouldn't be drained by legal fees. I know the facts better than anyone, but none of those were the real answer. So I told him the truth, because this isn't really about money. I paused. My father and brother have spent my entire life telling me who I am. He looked at me steadily. This time I told him quietly, "They're going to have to listen." The judge said nothing for a long moment. Then he glanced down at the thick file tucked beneath his arm. My personnel record. I noticed several pages already marked with colored tabs. His expression shifted slightly. Then he looked back at me and said something I kept thinking about for the rest of the day. Courtrooms have a way of revealing things people work very hard to hide. The second morning began differently. The judge entered carrying 2 files instead of 1. The estate case, and a second one that was much thicker. I recognized it immediately. My complete military personnel record, not the public summary version, the full document. Years of evaluations, certifications, commendations, educational records, federal investigation involvement, legal training documentation. Everything. My pulse quickened slightly, not from fear, from realization. The judge had done serious homework overnight. Lawson noticed the second file, too. His expression tightened for just a fraction of a second. Then the judge looked at him directly and said, "What exactly is your position regarding Ms. Carter's ability to represent herself?" Lawson gave his polished answer about the disadvantages of self-representation. The judge nodded slowly. Then he opened the file. 1 page, then another, then another. His eyes moved steadily down the documents. Then he said it. "She doesn't need a lawyer." The sentence landed like a hammer dropping onto stone. Nobody moved. Jason blinked. "What?" The judge continued reading calmly. "She possesses extensive legal training. She has completed advanced military legal education. She has participated in federal investigations involving financial misconduct. She has testified under oath in numerous official proceedings." Then he looked directly at Lawson. "According to this file, Ms. Carter has spent years handling matters far more complex than this probate dispute." I watched something happen in Lawson's face. Not fear, exactly. Recognition. The sudden and complete realization that he had fundamentally misjudged the person sitting across from him. He reached for his copy of my record. His eyes moved across the pages rapidly, then slower. Then he stopped moving entirely. The color left his face. Oh my God. He hadn't meant to say it. The words simply escaped before he could stop them. Jason turned toward him immediately. "What?" No answer. "What is it?" Lawson looked at Jason, then at me, then back at the file. "Look at her record." My father leaned forward, confused and suddenly very uncomfortable. "What record?" Lawson swallowed hard. And for the first time since this entire legal battle began, I watched him try to rebuild a strategy that had just collapsed underneath him. If this story is hitting you somewhere deep, pause for just a second. Give this video a like because it genuinely helps more people find stories like this one. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that being underestimated isn't the end of the story. And subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now back to the courtroom. Cross-examination began. The first witness I addressed was Mrs. Reynolds, the neighbor who had testified that Grandpa discussed changing his will after my visits became more frequent. I approached slowly. "Mrs. Reynolds, you testified yesterday that my grandfather discussed changing his will after my visits became more frequent. Correct? Yes, you're certain of the dates?" "Yes," I nodded once. "Can you tell the court exactly when those conversations occurred?" She gave several approximate dates. Then I opened a folder. Military travel orders. Official government records placing me overseas on deployment during every single date she had named. Thousands of miles away. The document was handed to her. She stared at it. Then she cleared her throat. "I must have remembered wrong." "You must have," I said quietly. Then I continued. "Did my grandfather ever tell you I pressured him?" "No." "Did you ever personally witness me pressure him?" "No." "Did he ever seem afraid of me in any way?" "No." "Then your entire testimony was based on assumptions?" She looked down. "Yes." A quiet murmur moved through the courtroom. 1 witness. 5 minutes. Decades of assumptions in ruins. The second witness I addressed had claimed my grandfather seemed isolated during his final years, the obvious implication being that isolation creates vulnerability. I asked him how many times he had actually visited Grandpa during that final year. He said several. I asked if he could be more specific. He said 5 or 6 times. Then I produced the visitor log from the nursing facility. Every visitor recorded by name, date, and duration. He reviewed it in silence, then admitted he had visited exactly twice. Neither visit had lasted longer than 20 minutes. He had never spoken with Grandpa by phone during that period. He had no access to any medical records. Then how had he concluded my grandfather was isolated? He swallowed. I assumed. I let that word sit in the air for a long moment. Then I returned to my seat. The damage was building steadily, quietly, methodically, the way real damage always does when it's done properly. Lawson was still skilled. He was still professional. But he was no longer controlling the room. He was reacting, defending, adjusting, and the adjustments kept coming too late. Then I requested permission to introduce additional evidence. The judge nodded. Proceed. The first item was security footage from the assisted living facility where Grandpa had spent part of his final year. Footage I had obtained legally through the discovery process months earlier. The recording appeared on the courtroom screen. The timestamp rolled. Grandpa walked through a hallway, slowly but steadily and with purpose. He greeted staff members by name. He held full conversations. He read documents carefully. He signed paperwork after reviewing it. He asked questions. He corrected mistakes. He made decisions. For nearly 20 minutes, the footage played. Nothing about the man on that screen suggested confusion. Nothing suggested vulnerability. Nothing suggested someone who could be led or manipulated by anyone. The image my father's legal team had been carefully building for 2 days was collapsing in real time, frame by frame, on a screen everyone in that courtroom could see clearly. When the footage ended, I stood. Your Honor, the plaintiffs repeatedly implied that my grandfather lacked the mental capacity to make independent decisions. I paused. The evidence shows otherwise. The judge looked at the screen for a moment. Agreed. Then came the financial records. Years of them. Bank statements, transfers, loans, withdrawals, checks. Every transaction organized chronologically, meticulously, precisely. I walked through them slowly. Over 8 years, my grandfather had provided financial assistance to multiple family members. Then I displayed the totals. Jason's face changed immediately. My father stared at the screen without blinking. The audience started whispering. The amounts were staggering. Repeated loans, repeated bailouts, business failures, credit card debt covered, vehicle payments made, mortgage assistance provided again and again. Thousands became tens of thousands. Tens of thousands became hundreds of thousands. And according to the certified bank records, almost none of it had ever been repaid. I turned toward the plaintiff's table. Would either plaintiff like to dispute these documents? Neither man spoke, because they couldn't. The records came directly from the financial institutions. Certified, verified, and completely accurate. Then came the final piece. The evidence I had protected until exactly the right moment. Emails, hundreds of them. Most were ordinary family communications. But buried among them were messages between my father and Jason. Messages neither of them had expected anyone to ever find. Messages about Grandpa's will. Messages about the money they expected to receive. Messages about applying pressure. One appeared on the screen. If Grandpa changes his mind, we're screwed. Then another. You need to talk to him again. Then another. He cannot leave that money to Emily. Jason's own words staring back at him in a courtroom full of witnesses. I watched the color drain from my father's face. I watched Jason go absolutely still. I watched Lawson slowly close his eyes because he hadn't known. That much was obvious from his expression. Then I played the recording. The one piece of evidence I had genuinely hoped never to need, because hearing Grandpa's voice again still hurt. Even after everything, even after all the training and all the years, the recording began. His voice filled the courtroom. Older, softer, but unmistakably clear and strong. Someone off camera asked him about the estate. Then Grandpa answered, "If anyone deserves it, Emily does." Silence. She never asked me for anything. I swallowed hard. She never treated me like a bank account. Nobody in the room made a sound. Then the final sentence. She loved me before she knew what I owned. The recording ended. The silence that followed was enormous. Judge Bennett looked at my father, then at Jason, then at Lawson. He folded his hands. Counsel. Lawson stood slowly. He looked like a man who had just realized a war he thought he was winning had actually already ended a long time ago. Do you wish to continue arguing undue influence? Lawson looked at the evidence. He looked at his clients. Neither man could meet his eyes. No, Your Honor. Those 3 words from their own attorney landed harder than any verdict could have. Jason lowered his head. My father stared blankly at the table, and for the first time in my entire life, neither of them looked powerful. They looked small. Okay, real quick. If this story is making you feel something right now, that's exactly why you should share it. Copy the link and send it to someone who has ever been overlooked, dismissed, or told they weren't enough. Like this video because it matters. And subscribe so stories like this find their way to you every time. Let's keep going. The final day of the trial felt strangely quiet in the way that only endings do. Word had spread. The courtroom was fuller than it had been on any previous day. Attorneys from other courtrooms slipped in during their breaks. Clerks lingered longer than necessary near the back wall. Everyone sensed they were about to witness the ending of something. They just didn't know yet how complete that ending would be. My father and Jason arrived looking like different versions of themselves. The confidence was gone. The smirking was gone. Jason didn't even look at me when I walked in. My father looked older, smaller, like the past few days had compressed years into hours. A strange feeling settled over me as I watched them. Not satisfaction, not triumph. Something quieter, something closer to sadness. Because despite everything, this was still my father. The man who taught me to ride a bicycle. The man who used to lift me onto his shoulders when I was small. The man who had somehow, somewhere along the way, become someone I barely recognized anymore. Judge Bennett delivered the ruling in a calm, measured voice. The kind of voice reserved for decisions that have already been made and cannot be undone. After reviewing all evidence presented, this court finds no basis for the plaintiff's claims of undue influence, coercion, fraud, or incapacity. The will of William Carter shall remain fully valid and enforceable. The plaintiff's petition is denied in its entirety. Furthermore, the plaintiff shall bear responsibility for all applicable court costs associated with this action. Jason closed his eyes. My father sat motionless. For most cases, that would have been the end. But there was one final matter I had been holding in reserve. One folder nobody had seen yet. I stood. Your Honor. The judge looked toward me. Yes, Miss Carter. I have one additional request. The room went completely still again. Lawson frowned. Jason looked confused. My father suddenly appeared frightened. I walked to the evidence table and picked up the final folder. Financial disclosures connected to the estate. The judge began reading. Page after page, and his expression changed in a way I had not seen from him before. His jaw tightened. What exactly is this? These records indicate substantial transfers that occurred shortly before the estate proceedings began, Your Honor. And these transfers were never disclosed to the court. No, sir. Jason's head snapped toward his father. What assets? My father said nothing. The silence in that moment told its own story. Slowly and visibly, Jason began to understand. The hidden transactions, the missing disclosures, the unexplained withdrawals. His own father had been keeping secrets from everyone, including him, the man who had been held up as Jason's protector, his champion, his rescuer, had been operating in the shadows while his son fought a courtroom battle without knowing the full truth. The judge addressed the clerk in careful, professional language that everyone in the room understood perfectly. I want copies forwarded for further review. Potential investigation. Potential consequences. Potential legal exposure that reached far beyond losing a civil case. Jason stared at his father. You knew about this. Nothing. Dad. Silence. The devastation on his face was not about the money. It was the realization that the man he had believed in completely had been lying to him too. The hearing ended. The room slowly emptied. People gathered belongings. Chairs moved. Papers shuffled. Life resumed the way it always does, regardless of what has just happened inside a room. But my father did not move. He remained seated, motionless, staring down at the table in front of him. I gathered my documents slowly. There was no celebration, no speech, no dramatic moment of triumph. Real victories in real life almost never feel the way you imagine they will. I placed the final folder into my briefcase. Then I heard my name, Emily. I turned. My father was standing a few feet away. He looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. Then he spoke. His voice was broken in the quiet, honest way that voices get when there is nothing left to protect. I never thought. He stopped. Tried again. I never thought you'd become this. I looked at him. The strange thing was I wasn't angry anymore. Anger takes energy. Years ago, I had simply run out of it. You never really looked, I said. Not as an accusation, just as a fact. His eyes dropped to the floor because he knew it was true. Then he whispered 3 words I had been waiting my entire childhood to hear. I was wrong. 30 years too late. Delivered in a near-empty courtroom with no audience to perform for. Just 2 people standing in the wreckage of a family that had never quite managed to hold itself together. I wish I could tell you those 3 words fixed everything. They didn't. Some wounds actually heal. Others become scars. You learn to carry them differently over time. My father took 1 step toward me, then another. Then his hand moved to his chest. His face changed. Confusion, pain, shock, all at once. Jason shouted. My father stumbled. The color left his face entirely. People rushed forward. Someone called for medical assistance. The courtroom filled with chaos. And my father collapsed, one moment standing, the next on the floor. Jason dropped beside him. Real panic in his voice. Raw and unguarded in a way I had never heard from him before. Just fear. The paramedics arrived quickly and transported him out. The room emptied slowly after that. Jason left with them. For once, he had absolutely nothing to say. An hour later, I walked out of that courthouse alone. The afternoon sun hung low above the city. The air felt lighter in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. Not because I had won, because something was finally, completely over. For years, I had chased my father's approval. Worked harder, achieved more, sacrificed more, believed that eventually, if I just kept going, he would see me, respect me, choose me. But standing on that sidewalk watching traffic move through the city streets, I finally understood something my grandfather had known all along and tried to tell me in his quiet way 100 times over the years. The people who refuse to see your worth cannot give you your value. Only you can do that. My grandfather saw who I was long before I saw it myself. And because he did, because he measured me with the right ruler, he changed the entire course of my life. If you have ever been underestimated, overlooked, or made to feel like you were never quite enough, I hope this story stayed with you. Because you do not need someone else's permission to become who you were always meant to be. And sometimes the most powerful victory isn't proving them wrong. It's finally realizing you never needed them to be right. Before you go, if this story moved you in any way, please take 3 seconds right now. Hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel because there are more stories exactly like this one waiting for you. And share this with someone who needs to hear it today. A friend, a sibling, someone who has been fighting quietly and needs to know that quiet fighters win too. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next story.